Ken is going to talk about how to avert a transportation funding crisis. If you are looking for his bio, you can find it on page 3 of the agenda. He's editor and publisher of Innovation News Briefs, which is almost every week makes an appearance in the Georgia Public Policy Foundation's Friday Facts. He's a widely read transportation. He has a widely read transportation newsletter, and he is an incredible expert on transportation funding. And he has been issuing warning cries for years and years. I know that for a fact. This is no surprise to us that we have a transportation funding crisis, and I'm going to let Ken talk a little about that and how to avert it. Thank you, Ken. Come on over. Or do you want to sit there?
I'll speak from my chair. Thank you, Emily, for this very kind and probably undeserved introduction. And hi, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. It's good to be here. Before I address the question in the title of my presentation, let me explain why there is a transportation funding crisis, or at least why some people believe there is a funding crisis. A 6-year transportation bill, which infrastructure boosters contend is essential to enable large multi-year projects and keep the nation's infrastructure in a state of good repair. That kind of bill would require roughly $320 billion, an average of about $54 billion a year, to maintain at current spending levels. Now, trust fund revenue and interest at the same time, over the same period, are projected to bring in only about $240 billion, according to CBO, and this would leave an unfunded shortfall of $85 billion. And even a stopgap 1-year bill would require about 12 or 13 billion in new revenue to maintain transportation spending at current levels. So where is that money to come from? Well, no one, neither in Congress nor among the many stakeholders, has come up with an answer. Now, to be sure, all the familiar suggestions for augmenting the federal transportation revenue are regularly dusted off at congressional hearings and various transportation meetings. And you probably know these include raising and indexing the federal fuel tax, transitioning to a mileage-based user fee, which Bob has already talked extensively about, supplementing the trust fund with general fund revenue, and increasing transportation revenue in the context of a more comprehensive tax reform. By the way, President Obama's favorite funding source, the so-called peace dividend, is seldom mentioned anymore, thankfully. The only fresh proposal has come from the Senate EPW Committee Chairman Barbara Boxer, who has pronounced herself in favor of following in the footsteps of my state, Maryland, and Virginia, and replacing the federal per gallon fee at the pump with a sales tax on gasoline collected at wholesale level. But none of the above suggestions have gained traction, not to speak bipartisan support, and some have been dismissed outright as impractical. For example, both the mileage fee and the comprehensive tax reform are deemed to be not ready for prime time. Basically, they're not implementable by October of next year, when the federal transportation program needs to be reauthorized. Likewise, the perennial proposal to increase the gas tax remains anathema in Congress, and the use of general funds to supplement the highway trust fund revenue finds very few supporters. As for more unconventional approaches, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Max Baucus has warned that the so-called accounting gimmicks that were employed to pay for MAP 21, the last bill, would not be used again in 2014. So this leaves observers wondering what other options are there left for Congress to consider. Other perhaps than the proposal once offered by House Republicans and soundly rejected by Democrats to adjust the scope of the future program to the actual tax receipts of the Highway Trust Fund, which still are a hefty $40 billion a year, nothing to sneeze at. But in fact, and this is where I come to trying to address the question in the title of my presentation. In fact, there is another way to fund infrastructure, an approach that would allow the aggregate level of investment to exceed trust fund revenue without creating an unacceptable shortfall. This approach, which has been largely overlooked or ignored by the Beltway community, which is single-mindedly focused on federal solutions, this approach would shift responsibility for major transportation investments to states and finance these investments with long-term debt. Now, there's a long-established precedent for this approach. In fact, all of the nation's private infrastructure is being financed in this manner. The vast voice and data transmission networks, the high voltage transmission lines, pipelines, electric generation plants, freight railroads, you name it. And equally importantly, long-term credit is the foundation underlying the $4 trillion municipal bond market, a market that would not exist were it not for the debt issued by cities and local governments, local public utilities especially, to finance their infrastructure needs. Now, true, debt financing would limit states to investing only in credit-worthy projects, that is, projects that generate a stream of revenue, such as tolls, or are backed by dedicated taxes or availability payments. But then virtually all of transportation mega projects today already fall in this category. In fact, except for mass transit projects and the California high-speed rail project, there are no major transportation facilities planned or under construction today whose completion hinges on federal appropriations. Whenever I mention this fact, people sit back amazed, but that is a fact. There are no projects that are that hinge on federal appropriations, and by this I mean major projects. On the other hand, our recent survey of state-level transportation funding has identified 19 jurisdictions that are currently constructing or proposing to construct new infrastructure without the benefit of federal dollars. Instead, they're using a combination of instruments, bond issues, long-term loans, availability payments, toll concession agreements, and even private equity risk capital. So a transition from federal funding to public and private financing of transportation infrastructure is already well underway. And I think it is likely to continue and grow given the persistent pressure to reduce federal discretionary spending. In fact, the automatic sequester cuts, which are to rise from $84 billion in 2013 to $109 billion in 2014, could place ever tighter constraints on government's ability to increase spending for infrastructure in the years ahead. So what conclusions can we draw from this growing state involvement in financing transportation infrastructure? Well, in the short run, I think more state revenue dedicated to infrastructure will lessen the pressure on Congress to come up with increased resources to fund the next surface transportation reauthorization next October. In fact, a 1 or 2 year bill now appears a distinct possibility, according to some of the sources I've talked to on Capitol Hill, and evidence of a growing ability and willingness of states to fund their transportation needs is cited as the reason. So that's an important issue to consider. In the longer run, I think greater state fiscal autonomy and greater fiscal sophistication could modify very fundamentally the federal-state relationship in transportation. There would be less need for direct federal financial aid to state DOTs, and probably more emphasis on credit assistance to support transportation investments of truly national scope and significance. And more generous credit assistance, by the way, could be provided through expanded federal credit facilities. There are 2 proposals on Capitol Hill these days, one by Senator Warner, the National Infrastructure Finance Authority, the other by John Delaney, the so-called Partnership to Build America bonds. So there are possibilities to expand the TIFIA program, which in itself is a fairly significant source of credit. So over time, I think there could evolve a twin system of funding the nation's transportation needs. Locally raised revenue supplemented by federal aid highway funds from the Highway Trust Fund, which is approximately $30 billion a year, would still be used by states to maintain their roads and bridges in a state of good repair. But large-scale reconstruction and system expansion projects that are beyond the state's fiscal capacity to fund on a pay-as-you-go basis would be financed from long-term credit and with long-term credit and availability payments. And this would result in a highway trust fund, which would be saved from insolvency, and the transportation community would be spared constant worry and uncertainty about the future of the nation's infrastructure program. So I rest my case here.
Thank you, Ken.